What would you do if a starving alien mother grabbed your arm in the middle of the night and whispered, "I'll be your slave, human. Just feed my child"? The night shift was almost over. The air outside the warehouse smelled like dust and gasoline, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes after hours of hard work. Daniel Rhodes dragged his boots across the cracked pavement, his shoulders heavy, his eyes stinging from fatigue. He wanted nothing more than a shower and a few hours of sleep before doing it all again. But someone was waiting for him. From the shadows near the old chain-link fence, a figure stepped forward. At first glance, Daniel thought it was a homeless woman. Torn clothing, hair tangled, shoulders bent, as if carrying a weight too heavy to name. But then he noticed her eyes, glowing faintly, reflecting light in a way no human eyes could. Behind her clung a small girl, thin as a twig, her face pale and hollow from hunger. The child's fingers gripped her mother's side as though she was her anchor to life itself. The woman's voice broke the silence. Her words came slowly, each one marked by an accent Daniel had never heard before. "I will be your slave, human. Just feed my hungry child." Daniel froze. His first thought was that he'd worked too many hours and was imagining things. His second thought was that maybe she was dangerous. But her eyes weren't threatening. They were desperate. He opened his mouth and shut it again. Finally, he managed, "What did you just say?" The woman drew her daughter closer, shielding her with her arms. "Food. She needs food. I will do anything." The girl pressed her face against her mother's side, too weak even to look up. Daniel's chest tightened. He had no idea who these people were, or what they were. He remembered the conspiracy forums, the shaky phone videos people posted online. Aliens spotted near Tucson. Strange lights above Flagstaff. Everyone laughed, wrote it off as drunks or pranksters. But now, standing in front of him, was proof he couldn't deny. Still, part of him wanted to walk away. If this was real, if this woman truly wasn't human, then anyone helping her was putting themselves at risk. The government didn't play nice when it came to things they didn't understand. And yet, how do you turn away a starving child? He cleared his throat. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I can't just..." The woman stepped closer, cutting him off. Her movements were cautious, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Please, I am Alara. This is my daughter, Sarah. We have nothing. We cannot stay outside any longer." Daniel blinked. "You're telling me you're not from here?" Alara's eyes flickered toward the sky, then back to him. "My vessel, destroyed. My mate is gone. Only she remains." Her hand moved protectively over Sarah's hair. "She will not last another night without food." Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes were softer versions of her mother's with that same faint glow. She whispered something in a language Daniel didn't recognize. It sounded broken, like a song stripped of melody. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. His mind screamed at him to walk away. Call the police, pretend he'd seen nothing. But the sight of Sarah's sunken cheeks and Alara's shaking hands burned through his hesitation. "Okay," Daniel muttered under his breath. Then louder, "Okay, I'll get you something to eat. But that's it. I'm not promising anything more." Relief washed over Alara's face. She lowered her head, almost bowing. "Thank you, thank you." Daniel raised his hand awkwardly. "Don't do that. Just stand up. We'll figure it out." As they walked toward his beat-up pickup truck, Daniel kept glancing sideways. The child barely moved, except to keep her grip on her mother. And Alara? She moved like someone carrying invisible chains. Each step was heavy, cautious, as if the world itself might collapse under her. Inside, Daniel's thoughts raced. If anyone saw them, what would happen? Would they both vanish into some government lab? Would he be arrested for even speaking to them? But the sound of Sarah's weak cough snapped him out of it. Whatever the risks, he couldn't let a kid starve in front of him. He unlocked the truck and nodded toward the back seat. "Get in, I know a place still open." Alara hesitated, scanning the empty parking lot before gently guiding Sierra into the seat. She slid in after her, eyes darting nervously at every passing car. Daniel started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows over the empty road. He gripped the wheel tighter than usual, his mind churning with questions he wasn't ready to ask. But he knew one thing for sure. His life had just changed. But even as the truck pulled away, he had no idea how much deeper this decision would drag him. The drive to the diner was only 15 minutes, but for Daniel Rhodes, it felt like an eternity. The engine rattled as if it might give out at any moment, and the silence in the truck was heavy enough to choke him. Every few seconds, Daniel's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Alara sat stiffly, her arms wrapped around Sierra like a human shield. The girl had dozed off, her head against her mother's shoulder, but her small hand still clung to Alara's sleeve. Daniel noticed how fragile she looked, her skin faintly translucent, her breathing shallow, like a flame that could flicker out with the smallest gust of wind. Daniel cleared his throat. "So, you can understand me just fine, huh?" Alara's gaze met his in the mirror, sharp yet tired. "Not all words? Enough." Her accent stretched the syllables, made her speech sound clipped, but it was clear she understood. Daniel drummed his fingers against the steering wheel. "And you're saying you're from, what, space?" Another planet, a pause, then softly, "Yes." He let out a shaky laugh. "This is insane." Absolutely insane. Alara's eyes didn't waver. "It is truth." Daniel wanted to argue, wanted to say he didn't believe her, but that glow in her eyes wasn't human, and no Hollywood contact lenses could mimic it so perfectly. Her skin had a faint shimmer in the light, subtle enough that you might miss it unless you stared. No hoaxer could fake that. Still, his practical side kicked in. "You realize what you're asking me, right? You can't just walk up to a guy after his shift and say, 'Hey, I'll be your slave.' That's not how things work here." Alara's head lowered. "I have no choice. Sierra needs food, shelter. I cannot give. Only beg." The blunt honesty in her voice made Daniel's stomach knot. He'd seen people down on their luck before. Homeless men outside convenience stores, addicts begging for $1. But this was different. This wasn't someone looking for spare change. This was a mother willing to trade her freedom for her daughter's survival. They pulled into the diner lot, a flickering neon sign buzzing above the door. A couple of trucks sat parked outside, engines cooling in the desert night. Daniel killed the ignition and turned to face them. "Okay, here's the deal," he said, lowering his voice. "You two stay close. Don't talk too much. People here, they'll notice if something feels off. And you already look different." Alara stiffened. "Different?" He winced. "I don't mean it bad. Just noticeable." She nodded as though she'd expected it. Her hand smoothed Sierra's hair and the little girl stirred awake, blinking with tired, glowing eyes. Inside, the diner smelled of fried onions and coffee that had been sitting too long. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes named Patty, gave Daniel a look of recognition. He'd stopped here plenty of times after shifts. "Long night, Rhodes?" she asked, handing him a menu. "Yeah," Daniel muttered, sliding into a booth. He gestured toward Alara and Sierra. "Friends of mine." Just passing through, Patty gave them a polite smile, though her brow furrowed slightly as she took in Alara's unusual features. Still, she didn't press. When the food arrived, burgers, fries, a plate of scrambled eggs, Sierra didn't hesitate. She reached out with trembling hands, stuffing pieces into her mouth as if afraid it might vanish. Daniel watched, his throat tightening. Alara touched her daughter's wrist gently. "Slow, breathe." She tried to pace her, but the girl shook her head, tears forming as she swallowed too fast. Patty raised an eyebrow but walked away, leaving them alone. Daniel leaned forward. "She hasn't eaten in how long?" Alara's eyes dropped to the table. 4 days. Only water, Jesus," Daniel muttered under his breath. Alara looked up. "You ask why I beg?" This is why the rawness in her tone left no room for argument. Daniel sat back, suddenly ashamed of the irritation he'd felt earlier. For the next half hour, Sarah ate until exhaustion took over again. She leaned against her mother, her small body finally still, her face softening as sleep claimed her. Daniel rubbed his temples. "All right, look, you can't stay out there, not like this, but if I take you with me, you have to understand. It's dangerous. For me, for you. People don't react well to things they don't understand." Alara tilted her head. "You help us." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. Why indeed? He didn't have an easy answer. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the memory of his own mother scraping by to raise him after his dad disappeared. Or maybe it was just the simplest truth. No parent should watch their child starve. He finally said, "Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't." For the first time, Ilara's expression softened. "Then, thank you." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. "Don't thank me yet. You're not safe, none of us are." But even as he said the words, Daniel knew the choice had already been made, and there would be no turning back. The neon sign outside the diner flickered one last time as Daniel pushed the door open, holding it long enough for Ilara and Sarah to step out into the dry Arizona night. The little girl's stomach was finally full, and her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, no longer carried that hollow emptiness. Daniel couldn't remember the last time a simple meal had struck him so deeply. Watching a starving child eat, it was the kind of thing you didn't forget. As they reached his pickup, Daniel hesitated with the keys in his hand. He knew exactly what he was doing, bringing two strangers, no, not strangers, something else entirely, back to his place. Any sane person would have called the authorities. But when he looked at Sarah resting against her mother's shoulder, he couldn't imagine handing her over to men in suits who would treat her like a specimen. He unlocked the door and gestured. "All right, back in. You'll be safe at my place for tonight." Alara paused. "Safe?" Daniel let out a short laugh. "Well, safer than here." They drove in silence, passing through the dimly lit streets of Glendale. Street lamps hummed above cracked sidewalks. Billboards loomed over half-empty parking lots. It wasn't much, but it was home to Daniel. He wondered what Alara saw when she looked out the window. To her, this probably looked like the ruins of a primitive world. Finally, they pulled up in front of Daniel's small apartment complex. The beige stucco walls were peeling and the stairwell lights flickered, but it was quiet, tucked between a gas station and a laundromat. Daniel parked, then turned to them. "Okay, we need to keep a low profile. Don't talk to the neighbors. Don't glow, or whatever it is you do with your eyes." Alara's lips tightened, but she gave a small nod. Inside, Daniel flipped on the light. The place was modest. One bedroom, a sagging couch, a table with unpaid bills stacked on it. He cleared his throat, embarrassed. "Not much, but it'll do." Sarah immediately moved toward the couch, curling up with a blanket Daniel tossed her way. Within seconds, she was asleep again, her small breath steady. Daniel found himself staring, almost protective, though he barely knew her. Alara stood in the middle of the room, uncertain. Her eyes scanned the space as though cataloging every detail. She finally asked, "This your dwelling?" Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, fancy, huh?" She tilted her head. "It is. Different. Heavy walls. Air stale. Welcome to Earth Apartments," Daniel said with a shrug. Then he grew serious. "You want to tell me what happened? To your ship?" Alara's shoulders sagged. She moved to the table and lowered herself into a chair. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with quiet precision, she began. "We traveled far. Many cycles. Our vessel carried families, children. We searched for refuge after war." Her eyes glistened as she spoke. "But something struck us. Fire in the sky. Pieces tore apart. I held Sarah, my mate. He was gone before we fell." Daniel swallowed hard. "And you landed here?" "Yes, in desert near fire and wreck. I carried her, walked until legs bled, found this place. She lifted her hand, showing faint scars across her palm. "We hid." Daniel rubbed his face. The story sounded insane, but her voice carried a weight that was impossible to fake. He didn't doubt her, not anymore. "You lost everything," he said quietly. Alara's gaze lowered. Everything but her. She glanced at Syrah, her expression softening. She is all. For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the old fridge. Daniel leaned back in his chair, torn between fear and sympathy. He knew he couldn't throw them out, but every instinct warned him that keeping them here could ruin his life. Alara broke the silence. "You risk for us. Why?" Daniel thought again of his mother. He remembered being 8 years old, watching her cry when she couldn't pay the electric bill, the way she still managed to put food on the table somehow. He thought of the nights when he swore he'd never let another kid go hungry if he could help it. He looked at Alara and said simply, "Because no kid should starve. Doesn't matter where you're from." Alara studied him, as though trying to decide if he spoke the truth. After a long pause, she whispered, "On my world, you would be honored for such words." Daniel shook his head. "Here, they'll just call me an idiot." They both almost smiled, though exhaustion weighed down their faces. As the night deepened, Daniel set a pillow and blanket on the floor for Alara. "You can take the couch when she wakes up, but for now you'll both need rest." Alara lowered herself onto the floor without complaint. She brushed a strand of hair from Syrah's face, her eyes soft with relief. Daniel turned off the lights and lay down on his own bed in the corner. But sleep didn't come easy. He kept replaying her words, her plea outside the warehouse. "I'll be your slave, human. Just feed my hungry child." The weight of it pressed against him. He had no plan, no answers, only a gnawing feeling that his quiet life had just been shattered in ways he couldn't predict. But for now, all Daniel could do was wonder how long he could keep them safe before the world outside noticed. Daniel woke up before dawn, his back sore from the old mattress and his head heavy with unfinished thoughts. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and listened. The apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of breathing, two rhythms he wasn't used to hearing in his space. On the couch, Syrah was curled up under the blanket, her chest rising and falling steadily. On the floor beside her, Alara sat upright against the wall, still awake. Her glowing eyes were open, fixed on the window as if she'd been guarding her child all night. "You didn't sleep?" Daniel asked quietly. Alara turned her head, her expression unreadable. "Sleep comes slow. Too much fear." Daniel frowned. "You don't have to stay on the floor like that. Couch is big enough." She shook her head. "She needs it more." There was something in her voice, firm, maternal, that Daniel couldn't argue with. He stood and shuffled toward the kitchen, starting the coffee maker. The bitter smell soon filled the room, making his stomach growl. He hadn't eaten since the diner either. When he returned to the table with a chipped mug in hand, Alara was still watching him. Finally, she said, "You live alone." "Yeah," Daniel replied, sitting down. "Been that way for a while." "Easier, I guess?" "Easier, but empty," she said softly. The comment hit closer than he expected. He looked away, staring at the steam rising from his cup. "Yeah, maybe." Syrah stirred, letting out a small sigh before turning over. Alara's eyes softened instantly, all her attention shifting to the child. She leaned down, whispering something in her own language, words Daniel couldn't understand but somehow felt tender, protective. After a moment, Alara asked, "Why do your people not see? Why do they not help when a child suffers?" Daniel exhaled. "Some do. But most, they're too wrapped up in their own problems, or they're scared. People fear what they don't understand." He paused, then added, "That includes you." Her gaze didn't falter. "I know. That is why we hide." Daniel leaned forward. "So tell me, what exactly are you hiding from? If your ship went down, there's got to be more of you, right? Survivors?" Alara hesitated. The muscles in her jaw tightened. There were others. Families. I do not know if they live. Flames took many. Some may have run like us, but if they are found, they will not be treated with kindness. You think the government's after you? She looked straight at him. Do you not? Daniel didn't answer right away. He'd grown up hearing stories, rumors of secret bases, experiments on creatures that didn't belong here. Most people laughed it off. But sitting across from Alara now, the idea felt terrifyingly possible. Yeah, he finally admitted. I do. Alara lowered her head. Then you understand why I cannot let them take her. Daniel studied her. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't asking for trust either. She was laying out a simple truth. She would fight to her last breath to protect her daughter. That Daniel could respect. Sarah slowly woke, blinking against the morning light. She rubbed her eyes, then sat up. Daniel offered her a piece of bread from the counter, and she accepted it with a small, tired smile. Thank you, she whispered. Her English was halting but clear. Daniel blinked in surprise. She speaks English? Alara brushed her daughter's hair back gently. A little. She listens. Learns Sarah chewed quietly, her small legs dangling off the couch. For the first time, Daniel saw more than hunger in her eyes. He saw curiosity. The way she looked around his apartment, at the clutter, the half-broken lamp, the pile of boots by the door. It was as if she was studying everything, storing it away. Daniel cleared his throat. So what happens now? You can't stay here forever. Someone's bound to notice. Alara straightened. I know, but I cannot move her again. Not yet. She needs strength. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. I get that, but we need a plan. People talk in this neighborhood. If someone catches sight of you... He trailed off, not needing to finish. Alara's expression hardened. Then we must be careful. Very careful. For a moment, their eyes locked, both of them aware of the unspoken weight hanging between them. Daniel leaned back, sighing. All right. For now, you stay, but only until she's strong enough to walk without stumbling. After that, we'll figure something out. Alara inclined her head slightly. That is more than I hoped for. The morning sun crept higher, its light spilling across the faded carpet. Daniel sipped his coffee, trying to steady himself. He'd made his choice last night, but choices had consequences, and his was about to drag him into a world he barely understood. But even as he told himself this was temporary, Daniel felt a gnawing certainty. It was only the beginning. By the third day, Daniel Rhodes' apartment felt smaller than ever. His one-bedroom space wasn't designed to shelter a secret, let alone two. Every creak of the hallway made his pulse spike. Every knock on a neighbor's door made him think someone had come for Alara and Sarah. He tried to stick to routine, going to work, keeping up with his shifts at the warehouse in Tempe, but things were slipping. Twice he'd shown up late, distracted by making sure they had food and water. His foreman, Chuck, a wiry man with a permanent scowl, noticed. You all right, Rhodes? Chuck asked one afternoon as Daniel struggled to load pallets onto a forklift. Yeah, just tired, Daniel muttered, avoiding his eyes. Chuck snorted. You're always tired, but this is worse. Don't make me cover for you again. Daniel forced a nod. Won't happen again. But as he drove home that night, the thought nagged at him. People were noticing. That was dangerous. When he unlocked his apartment door, the faint smell of something sweet hit him. Inside, Sarah sat cross-legged on the couch, a bowl of cereal in front of her. She looked up, grinning. Daniel, she said, her accent heavy but her voice bright. He blinked. Hey, you're talking more. Sarah giggled, pointing at her mother. She teach me. Alara stood near the table, folding the blanket they used at night. She listens quickly. Learns faster than I expected. Daniel smiled despite himself. Kid sharp. He sat down across from Sarah, who proudly repeated, Thank you. Food. You're welcome, he replied, genuinely moved. For all the danger this, watching a child learn, seeing her come alive again, felt worth it. But Alara's voice pulled him back to reality. She cannot stay hidden forever. She wants to move, to see Daniel frowned. That's not safe. You both stand out too much. One slip, one wrong look, and it's over. Alara folded her arms. We cannot live in shadows. She is a child. I get that, Daniel said firmly. But you don't understand this world. People don't just ignore things that look different. They'll take her. They'll take you. The silence that followed was thick. Syrah looked between them, sensing the tension. Alara's jaw tightened, but her voice was calm when she finally spoke. And you? You risk your life. Why do you stay? Daniel leaned back, sighing. Because you don't have anyone else. And I guess, neither do I. For the first time, Alara's expression softened. She didn't smile, but her eyes lingered on him with something close to respect. The fragile peace lasted a few days. Daniel kept sneaking food home, teaching Syrah simple words and watching as her energy slowly returned. She laughed more, asked questions, even hummed strange little melodies that didn't sound human. Daniel found himself listening at night, strangely comforted. But trust was still fragile, like glass under pressure. One evening, as they sat around the table, Alara spoke suddenly. You keep bills there. She gestured toward the stack of unopened envelopes. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Yeah, why? You struggle too, she said plainly. Yet you help us. Her bluntness hit him like a punch. That's my problem. Don't worry about it, but she didn't let it go. You give what you do not have. Why? He snapped more harshly than intended. Because if I don't, that kid of yours dies. That enough for you? The words hung in the air. Syrah froze mid-bite, her wide eyes shifting between them. Alara's expression hardened, but she lowered her voice for her daughter's sake. Do not speak of her that way. She is not a burden. Daniel rubbed his face, guilt instantly flooding him. I didn't mean it like that. I'm just tired. The tension slowly eased, but the crack remained. Trust was there, fragile but under strain. Daniel knew he had to be careful. Words mattered. That night, after Syrah had fallen asleep, Alara quietly approached him near the window. I know you fear. I know this is not your fight, but you choose to stay in it. That makes you more than you think. Daniel stared at her, unsure how to respond. Her words carried weight he didn't want to acknowledge. Maybe, he muttered, looking out at the streetlights below. But deep down, he knew the longer they stayed, the closer danger crept, and sooner or later, someone would notice. It started with a knock, not on Daniel's door, but on the one across the hall. Still, it was enough to send a jolt through him. He froze where he stood in the kitchen, a carton of milk in his hand, while Alara stiffened near the couch. Syrah immediately pressed herself into her mother's side. The knock came again, sharp, impatient. A neighbor's voice rang out. Hey, Rhodes, you in there? Daniel let out a slow breath. Not a stranger, not the government, just Kyle Berman, the guy who lived across the hall. Still, that didn't mean safety. Daniel stepped to the door and cracked it open. Kyle stood there, his baseball cap turned backward, chewing on sunflower seeds. His eyes darted past Daniel into the apartment. You got company? Kyle asked casually. Daniel blocked the doorway with his shoulder. No, why? Kyle spat a seed shell into a styrofoam cup. Thought I heard voices last night. Kid voices. You finally get yourself a girlfriend with a kid or something? Daniel's jaw clenched. You're hearing things. Kyle smirked. Maybe. Just curious. Place has been quiet since you moved in. Kind of weird to hear laughter all of a sudden. Daniel forced a chuckle. Guess I left the TV on. Kyle studied him for a long second before shrugging. All right, man. Just checking. Catch you later. When the door clicked shut, Daniel leaned against it, his heart pounding. He turned to find Alara standing rigid, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They are watching, she said flatly. It's just Kyle, Daniel replied. Nosy but harmless. Alara shook her head. No neighbor is harmless when truth hides in shadows. He didn't argue because deep down she was right. That night, Daniel drove to a grocery store on the edge of Mesa, far enough that no one from his neighborhood would see him. He stocked up on canned food, bottled water, and blankets. As he loaded the bags into his truck, he caught himself scanning the lot, half expecting unmarked vans or strangers lingering too long. Back at the apartment, Ilara and Sira waited in the dark. When he flicked on the light, Ilara stepped forward, lowering her voice. "I saw men outside today. Black vehicles. They stopped down the street." Watch Daniel's stomach drop. "And you didn't leave the apartment, right?" "No, we stayed hidden." He ran a hand through his hair. "Damn it, could be nothing. Or it could be everything." Ilara studied him. "You knew this risk when you took us in." "Yeah, well, it feels different when there are people sniffing around." He dropped the bags onto the table. "We'll need to be smarter." No noise, no lights after dark. Got it? Sira, sitting cross-legged on the couch, whispered softly, "Scared." Her mother bent down, pressing her forehead against the girl's. "No fear, little one. We are strong." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He wasn't sure who she was trying to convince more, her daughter or herself. The following days only worsened his nerves. A neighbor mentioned strange reports on the local news. Lights spotted outside Buckeye, talk of something crashing in the desert. Officials dismissed it as aircraft tests, but Daniel could read between the lines. People were talking, and talk spread fast. One evening, while Daniel was hauling a load of laundry back upstairs, he spotted a man parked at the corner of the complex. The engine idled, headlights off. Daniel slowed, pretending to dig through his bag, but the man didn't move. No phone in his hand, no cigarette, just watching. By the time Daniel slipped into his apartment and locked the door, sweat dripped down his back. He pulled the blinds shut, his mind racing. Ilara saw his face and stiffened. "They are here." "I don't know," Daniel muttered. "Could be nothing. Could be everything." She stepped closer. "Then you must decide. Do we stay or do we run?" Daniel looked at her, then at Sira, who was drawing shapes on scrap paper he'd given her. She looked up at him with those glowing eyes, her face full of trust he didn't feel he deserved. Running meant danger. Staying meant danger. Either way, the fragile balance they'd managed was crumbling fast. He lowered his voice. "We'll stay one more night. Tomorrow, we'll figure something out." Ilara's expression was grim, but she gave a slow nod. The three of them sat in silence that evening, the weight of the outside world pressing in. Daniel listened to every sound, the slam of a door down the hall, the footsteps on the stairs, the hum of traffic in the distance. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, and he knew something was coming. But what Daniel didn't know yet was how quickly suspicion could turn into action, and how fast the world could close its grip around them. The tension in Daniel's apartment built like a storm cloud ready to burst. Days of hiding, listening for every sound in the hallway, and watching shadows linger outside had worn everyone down. Even Sira, once so eager to learn new words, now spoke less, clinging to her mother whenever footsteps passed by the door. Daniel tried to carry the weight, but exhaustion showed in his face. He came home from another double shift with his shirt drenched in sweat, his eyes bloodshot. Tossing his keys onto the counter, he muttered, "This can't keep going." Ilara, who was mending a tear in Sira's sleeve with trembling fingers, looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Daniel said, dropping into a chair, "that I can't keep lying to my boss, my neighbors, everyone. Someone's going to figure this out, and when they do, it's not just you in trouble. It's me too." Ilara's eyes glowed faintly as her voice grew firm. "You knew the risk when you said yes." Daniel shot her a tired glare. "Don't put that on me. You showed up out of nowhere, begging me to feed your kid. What was I supposed to do? Just let her starve?" Sira shifted on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Her eyes darted between them, too young to grasp the full argument, but old enough to feel the fear in the room. Ilara's voice cracked. "I offered myself. I told you, I would give anything. I would belong to you if it meant she lived. Daniel slammed his hand against the table. I don't want a slave. Do you get that? I don't want you to bow or trade yourself away. That's not how this works here. The sharpness of his voice made Sarah flinch. Daniel instantly regretted it, running a hand down his face. Elara rose to her feet, her posture rigid. Then what do you want, Daniel Rhodes? You feed us, you shelter us, and yet you speak of burden, of danger. If you wish us gone, say it. I will carry her back to the streets. The image of Elara stumbling through alleys with her daughter's weak body in her arms made Daniel's chest seize. Don't say that. You'd both be dead in a week. Then what? She demanded. Daniel stared at her. He wanted to say he didn't know, but the words stuck. What came out instead was raw honesty. I want to believe this can work, that I can help you. But every time I walk out that door, I wonder if it's the last time I come back. I'm scared, Elara. Not of you, of what happens if the wrong people find out. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by Sarah's soft whimper as she buried her face in the blanket. Elara's features softened at the sound. She knelt, pulling her daughter into her arms, whispering soothing words in that strange, melodic language. Daniel sat back, guilt burning in his gut. He hadn't meant to lash out, but the fear inside him was eating away at his patience. When Elara finally looked back at him, her voice was quieter, though no less steady. You fear for yourself. I fear for her. We are not enemies, Daniel. We want the same thing, her life. Daniel exhaled, the fight leaving him. You're right. I don't know how long we can hold this together. Elara sat on the floor beside her daughter, stroking her hair. As long as we must. For a long while, the apartment was silent again. The argument hadn't solved anything, but something in it shifted the air between them. Daniel realized Elara wasn't trying to manipulate him with her earlier offer of servitude. It wasn't about power, it was about desperation, about the raw, unfiltered love of a parent who would throw herself on the fire if it meant saving her child. He looked at her, at Sarah curled against her, and understood the truth he hadn't wanted to face. He was already in too deep. Sending them away wasn't an option anymore. But outside forces were moving, and he couldn't protect them forever with only locked doors and whispered conversations. But the storm building outside his apartment was about to crash through his fragile walls, and neither compassion nor anger would be enough to stop it. The raid came without warning. It was just after midnight when Daniel's eyes snapped open to the sound of engines outside his apartment complex. Not one, not two, several. He threw off the blanket and stumbled toward the window, careful not to draw the blinds too far. What he saw turned his stomach cold. 3 black SUVs idling in the parking lot, their headlights off. Men in tactical gear moved like shadows between the vehicles, their radios crackling faintly in the stillness. Elara, Daniel whispered harshly. Wake her up. Now, within seconds, Elara was on her feet, pulling Sarah into her arms. The child stirred, confused and frightened, but Elara's voice was steady. Quiet, little one. We must go. Daniel's heart hammered as he grabbed his keys, his wallet, nothing else. Backstairs, he muttered. If we're lucky, they'll hit the front first. Elara's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. You knew this day would come. Yeah, Daniel said through clenched teeth. I just hoped it wouldn't be tonight. They moved quickly but carefully, each step sounding too loud in Daniel's ears. Down the back stairwell, past peeling paint and rusted railings, through a door that groaned louder than he wanted. Daniel winced, waiting for shouts above them, but the night stayed quiet, except for the faint crunch of boots near the front of the building. The trio slipped across the parking lot, Daniel leading the way toward his beat-up pickup truck. He unlocked it with shaking hands, shoving open the door. Elara slid into the back with Sarah, shielding her small body with her own. The engine sputtered to life just as voices barked orders at the front of the building. Daniel didn't wait. He slammed the truck into gear and rolled out of the lot, headlights still off until they hit the main road. His pulse raced as the city lights blurred past. Damn it, damn it! Alara's hand gripped the back of his seat. Where do we go? Somewhere they won't think to look. We just need distance, but distance wasn't enough. A pair of headlights flared in the mirror, a dark SUV turning onto the same road, closing fast. They follow, Ilara said sharply. Daniel cursed under his breath, slamming the gas pedal. The truck shuddered, old and slow compared to the sleek machine gaining on them. He swerved down a side street, tires screeching. Sarah whimpered in the back, clinging to her mother. Every turn Daniel made, the SUV followed. Whoever these men were, they weren't giving up. Finally, Daniel spotted a chance, a construction site off the road, half-finished foundations and steel beams scattered under floodlights. He yanked the wheel, barreling into the dirt lot. "Hold on!" he shouted. The truck jolted over uneven ground, rocks pelting the undercarriage. He cut the lights, weaving through stacks of concrete blocks. The SUV followed, but less certain now, its headlights swinging wildly as it tried to keep up. Daniel spotted a narrow gap between two piles of gravel and aimed for it. The truck scraped through with inches to spare. The SUV tried the same, too wide. Metal screamed as it clipped the piles, forcing the driver to slam the brakes. Daniel didn't wait. He cut across the lot, back onto a side road, and pushed the truck harder than he ever had before. Only when the SUV's headlights finally disappeared in the distance did he dare slow down. The silence that followed was deafening. His hands shook on the wheel. From the back seat, Sarah whispered, "Safe?" Daniel swallowed. For now. Ilara leaned forward, her voice low but fierce. "You saved us." Daniel shook his head. "No, that was luck, and luck runs out." He pulled into a deserted rest stop off the highway, cutting the engine. The three of them sat in the dark, breathing hard, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Ilara pressed her forehead against Sarah's. "Sleep, little one." "Mama's here," Daniel stared out the windshield, his thoughts a storm. He couldn't go back home. His job, his neighbors, his whole life. It was gone the moment those SUVs pulled into the lot. Turning to Ilara, he said, "We can't stay in Phoenix. We can't stay anywhere close. We need somewhere safe, someone who can actually help you." Her eyes met his in the dim light. "You know such a place?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't, not for certain. But he'd heard whispers before. Rumors of people who helped those the government hunted. People who didn't ask questions. Underground networks. Safe houses. "Maybe I said, he said, "but it won't be easy." Ilara placed a hand on his arm. "Then we go, whatever it takes." But even as Daniel nodded, he knew the danger hadn't passed. It had only grown sharper, and the road ahead would test every ounce of courage he had left. They left Phoenix before dawn, the old pickup rattling east along Interstate 10. The desert stretched endless on both sides, painted silver under the rising moon. Sarah slept curled up in the back seat, her small face peaceful for the first time in days. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, though every pair of headlights in the mirror made his stomach clench. He half expected black SUVs to appear again, engines growling, men pouring out with weapons raised. But the miles kept slipping by, and the night stayed still. Ilara sat upright in the passenger seat, silent for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Where do we go?" Daniel exhaled. "Tucson first. From there, maybe New Mexico. I've heard about people out there. Folks who help people the government's after. Not exactly official, but they know how to make people disappear." Ilara tilted her head. "Disappear?" "Not literally," Daniel said. "Just new names, safe places, people who don't ask questions." She studied him. "You trust them?" He shook his head. "Don't know them well enough to say that. But right now, it's the only shot we've got." The road hummed beneath the tires. They stopped once at a gas station outside Benson. Daniel filled the tank while Ilara and Sarah stayed inside the truck, heads ducked low. A trucker sipping coffee eyed Daniel but didn't speak. Back on the road, Daniel felt his shoulders ease, just slightly. By mid-morning, they reached Tucson. The city sprawled wide with mountains standing tall against the sky. Daniel pulled into a diner on the edge of town, parking near the back. Inside, the air smelled of bacon grease and strong coffee. A handful of locals nursed breakfast, their chatter low and steady. Daniel slid into a booth, Ilara across from him. Sarah sat close to her mother, still half asleep. A waitress with a sharp smile came by. "Coffee for you, hun?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, and maybe some pancakes for the kid." The woman's eyes flicked to Ilara and Sarah, lingering for a second too long before she walked away. Ilara leaned forward. Eyes everywhere. "Relax," Daniel muttered. "People stare at anyone who looks different here." Still, he felt the weight of her words. After breakfast, Daniel made a call from the payphone outside the diner. His hand trembled as he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A gravelly voice answered after 3 rings. "Who's this?" Daniel lowered his voice. "It's Rhodes. You still know people who handle situations?" A pause. Then, "You in trouble?" "You could say that. I've got 2 people. They need a place. Safe." The voice hesitated. "Not cheap, Rhodes, and not clean." Daniel swallowed. "I'll figure it out. Just tell me where to go." The man gave him an address outside Las Cruces, New Mexico. "Don't get followed. If you do, don't bother showing up." Daniel hung up, his palms sweaty. When he returned to the truck, Ilara was waiting with Sarah pressed against her side. "Well," she asked, "we've got somewhere to go. It's not much, but it's something." They drove again, hours rolling by as desert stretched endless. Sarah hummed softly in the back, her strange little melody soothing in its own way. Daniel caught himself glancing in the mirror, almost smiling at her resilience. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange, they reached the outskirts of Las Cruces. Daniel followed the directions to a weathered farmhouse sitting alone off a dirt road. A man in his 50s waited on the porch, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "You Rhodes?" he called as Daniel parked. "Yeah," Daniel said cautiously. "This them." He gestured toward Ilara and Sarah. The man studied them in silence, then jerked his head toward the door. Inside, before anyone sees, the farmhouse smelled of dust and wood smoke. A woman in a faded flannel shirt brought blankets and water without a word. Ilara guided Sarah to a chair, helping her drink. Daniel stood awkwardly until the man spoke. "You weren't lying." "Not human." Ilara bristled, but Daniel stepped in. "They're not a threat. They just need safety." The man gave a short laugh. "Nothing's ever that simple. But you brought them, so they're yours." Whatever happens, Daniel met Ilara's eyes. She didn't speak, but he saw it there, the same fear, the same hope. For the first time, Daniel realized he wasn't just helping strangers anymore. He was tied to them. Their survival was his survival. But as the farmhouse door shut behind them, Daniel couldn't shake the thought that safety was only temporary and bigger battles were waiting beyond these walls. The farmhouse creaked with every gust of desert wind, its walls holding stories of survival from years past. Daniel sat at the old wooden table, elbows on the scarred surface, staring at the lamp's glow. Ilara and Sarah rested in the next room, finally able to breathe without fear of footsteps in the hallway or engines outside the window. The man who had taken them in, he'd called himself Frank Calder, leaned back in his chair across from Daniel, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. "You know what you've done, Rhodes?" Daniel rubbed his temples. "Saved a kid from starving." Frank exhaled smoke, shaking his head. "Maybe. Or maybe you've just painted a target on your back that won't wash off. People don't forgive things like this. Not the government, not the kind of men who came after you." Daniel looked at the doorway where Ilara's silhouette lingered faintly, watching from the shadows. "Then I'll live with it." Ilara stepped forward, her voice steady but softer than before. You risked more than your life, Daniel Rhodes. You risked your place in this world. Why? Daniel hesitated, searching for words that fit the weight in his chest. Because I couldn't walk away. Because I remember being a kid and watching my mom do everything to keep me alive. She worked herself raw, went without meals so I could eat. I swore I'd never let another child go hungry if I could stop it. Doesn't matter if she's from here or from a world I'll never see. Alara's glowing eyes softened. For the first time since he met her, Daniel saw her shoulders relax, just slightly. Then you are more human than most I have met. From the corner, Frank scoffed. You talk like this is some fairy tale. You really think compassion's enough to keep you alive? Daniel's voice sharpened. Maybe not, but it's enough to keep me human. Silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. Sarah stirred, wandering sleepily toward the table. She looked at Daniel, then at her mother, before whispering, "Safe now?" Daniel crouched down to her level, his rough hands resting on his knees. Safe for tonight, and that's a start. Sarah leaned against him, small and warm, her trust heavy in his chest. Later, after Frank and his wife retreated to their room, Daniel and Alara sat alone at the table. The desert outside was vast, the stars sharp against the sky. You know this can't last forever, Daniel said quietly. Alara nodded. I know, but every day she lives is a victory. Every breath a gift. Daniel studied her. You'd really give yourself away, body, freedom, everything, for her. Alara met his eyes. Yes, a mother's life is not her own. It belongs to her child. But you showed me something else. That help can come without chains. That compassion exists. Daniel leaned back, exhaustion heavy in his bones. It's not chains, Alara. It's choice. You asked to be a slave, but all I saw was a mom begging for help. No one should have to beg like that. Her gaze lingered on him, unreadable. Finally, she whispered, perhaps your world is cruel, but perhaps there are people like you who can change it. They sat in silence, the night stretching long, both aware that the road ahead would be harder than anything behind them. But something had shifted. The bond forged in desperation was now welded in trust. Sarah's soft breathing drifted from the other room, steady and strong. She would live another day. And maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be brighter. Daniel stared out the window at the desert horizon. His life had been ordinary before. Now it was tangled with something bigger, something dangerous, but also something worth fighting for. Whatever happens, he said quietly, you're not alone anymore. Alara's voice was firm, carrying both gratitude and resolve. Nor are you. And in that moment, the weight of their journey, the fear, the hunger, the chase, it all settled into a truth Daniel could live with. Survival was never just about hiding, it was about choosing compassion, even when the cost was high. Because in the end, that was what made life worth living. If you believe kindness still matters in a world that often forgets it, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, because sometimes the smallest act of compassion can change everything.